Have you ever had someone smile in your face for years, then one day sit across from you and calmly explain how they were about to take your children, your home, your money, and even your name with it? Have you ever felt that kind of fear? The kind that doesn't make you scream at first, it makes you go cold. What would you do if the man who once promised to protect you suddenly looked at you like you were nothing more than a problem to remove? And can you imagine how terrifying it is when you know that if you react the wrong way, if you cry too hard, if you get too angry, if you raise your voice even once, people won't see your pain, they'll just see a black woman they've already decided is difficult. That was the moment my whole body went numb. My husband didn't ask for a divorce like a man whose marriage had fallen apart. No, he announced it like a man reading out a sentence. He looked me dead in the eyes and said he was taking everything, the house, the money, the life we'd built, and then he said the one thing that made the floor disappear under me, that I'd never see the kids the way I thought I would. He said it so calmly, so confidently, like this was already done, like I should have known better to think I had any power left. And the worst part is, he believed it. He believed I would panic. He believed I would fall apart. He believed he would do exactly what he needed me to do, become emotional, become desperate, become the kind of woman he could point at and say, "See, this is why I need full control." He thought fear would make me sloppy. He thought humiliation would make me beg. He thought if he hit my deepest fear hard enough, losing my children, losing my security, losing the little dignity I had left, I would hand him the final victory myself. But here's what he didn't understand. The most dangerous moment in a woman's life is not always when she's crying. Sometimes it's when she goes quiet. When my lawyer shouted, "Fight back," I should have done what everyone expected. I should have refused, I should have argued, I should have thrown those papers back in his face and told him he'd lost his mind. But I didn't. I signed them, calmly, page after page, signature after signature. I let him sit there and watch me do it. I let him think my silence meant I was defeated. I let him walk away feeling 10 feet tall. And for 2 whole weeks, he celebrated. He celebrated like a man who had already buried me. He celebrated like he had beaten a woman he thought too tired, too scared, too alone to fight. He celebrated because he thought I had given up. I was laughing, not because I wasn't afraid. I was terrified. I laughed because in all his planning, in all his threats, in all his confidence, he forgot something. One small thing. One very important thing. And by the time he remembered it, it was already far too late. That's the part he never saw coming. And if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or threatened by someone who thought your silence meant weakness, then stay with me. Because what happened next turned his victory into the beginning of his worst mistake.
For years after they got married, I think people probably looked at my marriage with the kind of quiet envy that people sometimes have for lives that look polished from the outside. Nice house, 2 beautiful kids, a husband with a confident smile and a steady voice, holiday photos where everyone is color coordinated and glowing. The kind of life people look at online and think, she's lucky, she has it all. And maybe that was the first real problem. From the beginning, my life looked so put together that nobody ever asked what it was costing me to hold it together. I wasn't weak. I need to say that, because women like me are so often described in extremes. If we endure too much, people think we're foolish. If we speak too loudly, they think we're angry. If we stay calm, they think we're cold. But I wasn't any of those simple little labels he liked to hide behind. I was a woman doing what millions of women do every day. I was surviving quietly. I was carrying more than anyone could see. And I was doing it while trying to protect my children from the kind of tension that can poison a home long before it breaks it. The truth is, when I first met my husband, he didn't seem dangerous. He seemed safe. That's what still chills me when I think about it. He wasn't the kind of man who storms into your life with obvious red flags flying. He was measured, thoughtful, well-spoken. He knew how to make people feel comfortable around him. He knew how to make me feel seen, at least in the beginning. He remembered details, he asked about my dreams, he told me he admired how driven I was, how intelligent I was, how strong I was. And for a while, I believed I had found a man who didn't fear a strong woman, but respected one. What I didn't understand then is that some men admire a strong woman the same way a collector admires something rare, not because they want it to stay free, but because they want to be the one who owns it. Back then, I was building a good life for myself. I had worked hard, harder than most people knew. I came from a family that believed in dignity, education, and making something solid out of very little. My mother had taught me early that as a Black woman, the world would often expect me to be twice as good and half as tired. She used to say, "You cannot control what people assume about you, but you can control what you build." So I built. I built discipline, I built a career, I built a home inside myself that nobody could just hand me. And maybe that's part of why he chose me. I already had roots, I already had value. Being with me elevated him in ways he never admitted out loud. In the early years, it felt balanced enough. We laughed, we made plans, we talked about the future as if we were designing it together. When the children came, I threw myself into motherhood with everything I had. And I don't mean the sweet version people like to post about. I mean the real thing. Sleepless nights, nursing through exhaustion, working while carrying invisible guilt, missing pieces of myself, and then hating myself for even noticing they were missing. I loved my children more than language can hold. But motherhood also made me vulnerable in ways I had never prepared for. Suddenly, every decision had higher stakes. Every risk felt dangerous. Every conflict felt like it could ripple through tiny hearts that trusted me to keep them safe. And then, slowly, so slowly, I almost feel stupid saying it now, the balance in our marriage began to shift. He started taking over certain things to help. That's how it always sounded. Helpful, sensible, practical. He said he was better with the finances, so he'd manage the larger accounts. He said he was trying to reduce my stress, so he'd handle conversations with the mortgage people, the insurance company, the tax preparer. He said I had enough on my plate, so he'd take care of paperwork. If I questioned something, he'd laugh lightly and tell me not to worry too much. If I pressed harder, he'd say I was making ordinary things dramatic. And if I let it go, he'd reward me with kindness just warm enough to make me wonder if maybe I was overthinking it after all. That was his gift. Not cruelty in obvious doses, control in deniable ones. He never had to forbid me from anything outright. He just made it exhausting to challenge him. He made me feel like asking too many questions was a form of distrust, like wanting access to all our information meant I was paranoid, like checking details somehow insulted him. And because I was already carrying so much, because I was trying to keep peace for the kids, because every woman knows how draining it is to battle over every little thing, I began choosing my silence carefully, not because I agreed, because I was tired. There is a special kind of loneliness in being married to someone who is adored by everyone else. People saw him as calm, responsible, dependable. He knew how to perform goodness in public. He could charm a room in 5 minutes. He helped neighbors carry boxes. He joked with teachers at school events. He was patient with waiters, polite to older women, generous enough for people to call him a good man. And every time someone praised him in front of me, I felt something in me fold inward just a little more, because I knew what they didn't see. They didn't see the way his face changed when no one else was around. They didn't hear the tiny humiliations wrapped in reasonable tones. They didn't understand how a person can control a house without ever once raising a hand. He learned my soft spots with a precision of someone studying a map. He knew I feared instability because I had worked so hard to escape it. He knew I feared public embarrassment. He knew I feared anything that could touch my children's peace. And more than anything, he knew I feared being misread. That fear sat deep in me, deeper than I wanted to admit.
As a Black woman, I had spent my whole life managing how I was perceived. At work, I had to be warm but not too familiar, assertive but never harsh, capable but never threatening. In motherhood, I told myself that choosing calm made me mature, that matey love sometimes meant absorbing more than was fair. But little by little, that habit became a cage. There were moments, of course, when I almost left. Small moments that didn't look dramatic from the outside, but stayed with me like splinters. The time I found out he had moved money between accounts without telling me and then stared at me like I was crazy for caring. The night he mocked me for being too emotional after I asked why a bill went unpaid when we had more than enough to cover it. The way he'd apologize just enough to stop the bleeding, then circle back later and rewrite the entire event until I found myself doubting my own memory. That kind of manipulation does something dangerous to your spirit. It doesn't just hurt you, it makes you less certain that your hurt is valid. And then there were the children. God, the children. People who have never been in a marriage like that always ask the same question. Why didn't you leave sooner? As if leaving is one clean, brave decision, as if you don't make that decision over and over in your head while calculating school routines, emotional fallout, custody risks, finances, where you'll live, what the kids will hear, who they'll believe, whether one wrong move will hand an already controlling man exactly the legal opening he's waiting for. I thought about leaving more times than I can count. But every time I imagined it, I also imagined him turning my worst fears into strategy. I imagined him painting me as unstable, difficult, bitter. I imagined a courtroom looking at my composure as coldness and my pain as aggression. I imagined my children caught in the middle of adult warfare they never asked for. So I stayed. Longer than I should have. Longer than I'm proud of. But not because I was blind and not because I was weak. I stayed because I was trying to time my survival around my children's safety. I stayed because I knew that walking out before I understood the full landscape could cost me more than my marriage.
The night he finally said it out loud did not start like a night that was going to change my life. That's the part people rarely talk about. The worst moments don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they show up between ordinary things. The kids had finished dinner. One of them was half asleep on the couch. There were dishes in the sink, a school form on the counter, a basket of unfolded laundry waiting in the corner like every other night and every other tired household. I was still moving through the motions of motherhood, still doing what needed to be done, when he said in that unnervingly calm voice of his, "We need to talk." And something inside me tightened instantly, because when you live with someone who controls through tone, not volume, you learn to fear calm more than shouting. I followed him into the dining room, and I remember noticing ridiculous little details, because my body already knew before my mind caught up. The chair pulled out too neatly, a folder on the table, his phone face down beside it, a glass of water he had poured for himself but not for me. It looked less like a conversation and more like a meeting, less like a marriage ending and more like a plan being unveiled. He didn't ask how I was, he didn't hesitate, he didn't circle around the subject like a man grieving in the collapse of his family. He got right to it. He said he wanted a divorce. And there it was, that word. So clean coming out of his mouth, so violent landing in my chest. I didn't speak right away. I wish I could tell you I was strong in that moment, that I met his eyes and matched his energy, but the truth is more human than that. My first feeling wasn't anger. It was fear, raw, immediate fear. Not because the marriage was ending. Deep down, I think I'd known for a long time it was already over. No, the fear came from the way he said it, like he wasn't asking for a divorce, like he was announcing the results of a process that had already happened without me. Then he leaned back, folded his hands, and started listing what would happen next. He said he would be keeping the house. He said he had already looked into the financial structure, and there was no realistic path for me to challenge what he intended to do. He said I was in no position to support the children the way he could. He said stability mattered, and courts liked stability. He said the children would be better off in the environment he could provide. Then he looked at me and delivered the line that made my blood run cold.
He said, if you fight me, you will lose badly. If you're smart, you'll make this easy. Otherwise, you'll hardly see the kids, and when you do, it won't be on the terms you want. There were sentences that split your life into before and after. That was one of them. I remember staring at him and feeling like I had suddenly become very small in my own home. My first instinct was denial. Surely he couldn't mean this. Surely no father says that about his own children unless he's trying to wound the mother more than he loves the family. But then came the second instinct, the more dangerous one. What if he can do it? What if all those little comments over the years, all those reminders about stability and courts and money and image, had not been empty intimidation? What if he really had been preparing? What if I had spent all these years trying to keep peace while he quietly built a case against me? He must have seen my fear on my face, so he softened his tone in that fake, reasonable way he used when he wanted cruelty to sound like logic. He said he didn't want this to get ugly. He said if I cooperated, things could stay civil. He said if I acted emotionally, I would only make things harder for myself. Then, as if he were discussing the weather, he pushed the folder slightly towards me and said there were preliminary papers already drafted. He wanted to move quickly. For the children, he said. For everyone's peace. That was the moment I understood this had been coming for longer than I knew. He hadn't just decided to leave, he had decided to corner me. He had chosen a night when the children were home but distracted, when I was tired, when the house itself would pressure me to stay composed. He had come prepared with documents, language, strategy. He had likely rehearsed the tone. Every part of it was designed to keep me off balance while making him appear calm and organized. And because he knew me so well, he knew exactly where to press. Not at my pride, not at my heart, at my deepest terror. My children. He knew that if he threatened my relationship with them, my whole body would go into survival mode. He knew fear could scramble even a smart woman's thinking. He knew that if he convinced me I was one emotional reaction away from losing them, I might start cooperating out of panic before I ever sought proper advice. So I asked the only thing I could force past my throat. I asked, "Are you really saying you'd try to take my children from me?" He didn't even flinch. He said, "I'm saying the court will look at who can provide the most stability. You should think very carefully before turning this into a fight you can't win." That answer told me everything. Because men who love their children don't speak about them like leverage. Men who are heartbroken don't look relieved while threatening the mother of their kids. Men who still have some softness left don't sit in the family dining room and talk about custody like a weapon they've been waiting to use. In that moment, whatever confusion I had carried for years started burning off. This wasn't a marriage in decline anymore. This was a power move. But knowing that didn't make me less afraid. It made me more afraid, because now the danger had a shape. I don't remember much of the next few minutes in order. Trauma does that. It gives you flashes instead of a clean timeline. I remember the edge of the folder under my fingertips. I remember hearing the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I remember one of the kids laughing faintly from the living room and feeling like I might break in half from the contrast of it. Life was still going on in the next room. Homework, cartoons, bedtime routines, and here I was, realizing that the man I had built a family with was preparing to use that family against me. I asked him how long he had been planning this. He shrugged, almost bored, and said he had simply been realistic. He said, unlike me, he liked to be prepared. That line landed exactly the way he intended. Unlike me, meaning emotional, meaning careless, meaning weak. He had always done that, slipped insults into ordinary sentences so smoothly that if I reacted, he could act confused about why I was upset. But something happened right there that I didn't fully understand until later. Instead of exploding, I got quieter. Not because I was surrendering, because some instinct deeper than panic told me he was watching for a performance. He wanted tears, he wanted outrage, he wanted something he could later describe as instability, a woman unraveling, a wife too volatile to be trusted in a dispute over children. Maybe years earlier I would have given it to him without meaning to. Maybe years earlier I would have defended myself emotionally, trying to force him to hear my pain. But pain was not what he was listening for. He was listening for proof. So I did something that surprised even me. I asked if I could review the paperwork with an attorney. He smiled, not a warm smile, a winner's smile. He said, of course, though he warned me that dragging things out would only increase legal costs and make me look less cooperative. There it was again, that manufactured reasonableness. He always wanted his threats to sound like advice. I took the papers upstairs and shut the bedroom door. The moment I was alone, my hands started shaking so hard I had to put the folder down on the bed. I read the first page and then had to sit down because my vision blurred. He had moved fast, faster than I expected. The language in the documents was careful, but the intention was brutal. Asset division tilted in his favor, custody language framed around consistency and continuity, terms that looked neutral to an untrained eye, but once understood could shift power dramatically. He was not bluffing. He was positioning himself to look like the stable parent, the financially organized spouse, the reasonable adult handling a difficult woman. I felt sick. And beneath the fear came humiliation, because there is something deeply humiliating about realizing someone has studied your vulnerabilities while pretending to love you. Every compromise I had made to keep peace suddenly looked different. Every time I had chosen silence to protect the children, every time I had let him handle it, every time I had avoided conflict because I was exhausted, all of it now looked to him like proof that he could overpower me legally as easily as he had overpowered me emotionally. But fear can sharpen you if it doesn't drown you. I called my lawyer the next morning. Now, I need to explain something. I didn't have some dramatic legal team waiting in the shadows. I wasn't living a double life. But a while before all this, during one of the many times I had felt something was off, I had quietly asked around and gotten the name of a family attorney. Not because I was ready to leave, because I was trying to understand what I might be facing if I ever had to. I never thought I'd need that number so soon. When I called, my voice was so tight I barely sounded like myself. I said I needed an urgent consultation. I said my husband had presented divorce papers and was threatening to take everything, including the children. There was a pause on the other end. Then the attorney said in a tone that cut through my panic, "Do not sign anything else until I review every page." That sentence gave me a tiny foothold, just enough to breathe. At the consultation, I laid it all out. The years of financial control, the threats, the way he framed custody, the accounts he handled, the property, the children. I expected the lawyer to tell me I had made too many mistakes, that I should have left sooner, that he had outmaneuvered me. Instead, she did something I'll never forget. She listened. Really listened. Not just to the facts, but to the pattern. Then she looked at me and said, "He wants you afraid. Fear is part of his strategy. That does not mean his strategy is airtight." I nearly cried from relief right there. But relief was quickly replaced by urgency. As she reviewed the paperwork, her expression changed in ways I was learning to read. Certain lines made her sit forward. Certain clauses made her ask follow-up questions. Had he always controlled the accounts? Did I have copies of old statements? Was the house purchased before or during the marriage? Had any down payment connected to personal funds, family money, inheritance, or property held separately? Had there been transfers recently? Had I noticed unusual spending? Did he ever move assets between accounts without explanation? Every question opened another door in my mind. Things I had dismissed, things I had noticed but not documented enough. Things that now mattered more than I understood. When I told her about his threat to take the kids, her jaw tightened. She said judges do not like parents who use children as weapons. She said custody threats are often bluffs by controlling spouses who assume fear will force cooperation. But then she also warned me of something hard and necessary. Bluffs can still be dangerous if the other side has better paperwork, better presentation, or a cleaner image. She was honest. She said this needed to be handled carefully, strategically, calmly. You cannot afford to give him the version of you he's expecting. That line stayed with me. I went home from that meeting carrying two opposite emotions at once, terror and possibility. Terror because the fight was real now. possibility because for the first time, someone with knowledge had looked at his plan and not immediately called it unbeatable. But the situation was still razor sharp. He initiated, he had already chosen the narrative, he believed I was cornered. And in some ways, I was. The next few days were a blur of normal life on the surface and legal emergency underneath. I packed lunches while forwarding documents. I braided hair and helped with homework while trying to remember old account numbers and important dates. I smiled at my children while feeling like my chest was full of broken glass. It is one of the cruelest things about motherhood that your hardest private collapses still happen while someone needs a snack, someone needs socks, someone needs a permission slip signed by morning. I didn't get to fall apart fully. The kids still needed me soft. The world still expected me functional. And then came the call that changed the direction of everything. My lawyer had finished a first full review of the papers, and she was furious. Not panicked, furious. She said, "He thinks he can bully you into signing a version of reality that serves him. You need to fight back, immediately." She explained that parts of what he was claiming were aggressive enough to be challenged hard. Some assumptions he was relying on might not survive scrutiny. Certain financial positions looked too neat, too convenient. And if there were records to support even part of what I had described, then his confidence might be less about truth and more about intimidation. I should have felt empowered hearing that. Instead, I felt another wave of fear. Because fighting back sounded dangerous. Not morally dangerous, practically dangerous. He had spent years training me to believe escalation would only hurt me more. Even now, with legal support, I could hear his voice in my head. Don't make this ugly. Don't make a fight you can't win. Don't act emotional. Don't be stupid. That is how control survives even after you recognize it. It keeps speaking through your own anxiety. My lawyer must have heard the hesitation in my silence because she got even more direct. She said, "If you hand him this level of control now, you may spend years trying to undo it. He is counting on your fear. Don't give him your future just because he sounds confident." Those words should have made the next step obvious. But this is where the story took the turn nobody expected. Because I did something that shocked even my lawyer. I signed. The first time I tell people that, they think I mean I signed because I was beaten, because I lost my nerve, because I let him win. But that's not what happened. Not exactly. What happened was more complicated, more frightening, and in the end, much more powerful. I had spent enough years with that man to understand one thing clearly. When he believed he had total control, he became careless. Arrogant people often do. The more certain they are of victory, the sloppier they get. The more they celebrate, the more they expose. And by then, after my lawyer's review, after the questions she had asked, after the details beginning to surface in my mind, I had started to suspect there was something he was overlooking. Something important. Something hiding inside his confidence, like a crack in glass you can't see until pressure hits it. When he came home that evening, he expected resistance. I could feel it. The house was tense in that unnatural way houses become when a secret war is underway. The children were nearby, dinner had been eaten in pieces, nobody was relaxed. He asked if I had reviewed the documents, and there was this almost eager stillness in him, like he was preparing for drama, preparing to be the calm man opposite the unreasonable wife. Instead, I said yes, quietly. I sat down at the table, the same table where he had threatened me, the same table where my marriage was reduced to leverage and paperwork. I picked up the pen. My hands were steady in a way that frightened even me. He watched my face as if trying to decode whether I was numb or broken. Maybe I was a little of both, but I was also thinking, watching, calculating. I signed one page, then the next, then the next. He blinked. Actually blinked, like he had prepared for a storm and didn't know what to do with clear skies. He said, "That's probably for the best." That's all he said. No softness, no gratitude, just satisfaction, disguised as civility. He thought he had won completely. He'd no longer needed to hide it. I looked at him and gave him exactly what he was least prepared for. Nothing. No tears, no pleading, no last-minute appeal to his conscience. I signed the final page and slid it back to him. He took the papers with the expression of a man trying not to look triumphant and failing. That expression told me more than any shouting match ever could. He truly believed I had collapsed. He believed the threat worked. He believed my calm meant surrender. He believed that after all his planning, all his pressure, all his years of control, he had finally pushed me exactly where he wanted me. And that was the moment the real conflict began. Not because I had given up, but because he no longer saw me clearly. For the next 2 weeks, he would celebrate what he thought was his victory. And during those same 2 weeks, everything he thought he had secured would begin to unravel from the one thing he forgot.
The 2 weeks after I signed the papers taught me something I wished I never needed to learn. Nothing is more unsettling than living in the same house with someone who thinks they've already erased you. My husband didn't become kinder after I signed. He became lighter, freer. That was almost worse, because cruelty wrapped in anger can at least be recognized for what it is. But cruelty wrapped in relief? That has a colder edge. It meant he no longer felt the need to negotiate with my humanity. In his mind, the difficult part was over. He had broken me. I had complied. The rest, he assumed, would simply be logistics. He moved through our home like a man who had already repossessed it. He stood in doorways a little longer than usual, looked around rooms with a quiet ownership that made my skin crawl, and started making practical little comments about the future as if I was just another detail to be arranged. We'll need to think about where you're going to stay long term. The kids will need consistency. I'm glad this won't drag into something ugly. Every sentence was polished, almost reasonable. That was his specialty, making domination sound like order. And every time he did it, I had to fight the urge to react. Not because I had no response, I had too many. Because by then, the hidden work had already begun. My lawyer was building the legal response. The forensic accountant was reviewing records. Old files were being pulled. Dates were being reconstructed. I was sending over everything I could find. Every document, every old email, every closing paper, every account summary, every piece of financial history I had once been too exhausted to organize. The outside of my life still looked deceptively normal. Inside, it was becoming an operation. I would wake up before the children, sit at the kitchen table in the half-dark while the coffee brewed. When the coffee brewed, go through old digital folders, school pictures, medical forms, tax files, password reset emails, bank PDFs, notes I had typed into my phone late at night after arguments I didn't yet know would matter. Then I'd hear little feet coming down the hallway and have to transform instantly. Breakfast voice. Mommy face, hair to be brushed, lunches to be packed, permission slips, missing shoes, morning cartoons. There is a particular kind of emotional whiplash in searching for evidence of financial concealment at 6:10 a.m. and then cutting strawberries into heart shapes at 6:35 a.m. because your child likes them that way. That was my life in those days. Legal war before sunrise, tenderness by routine, terror in between. And the children were beginning to feel the shift. Even though we hadn't explained everything yet, children don't need full sentences to sense when a house is changing. My son became quieter. My daughter watched me with those sharp little eyes that missed nothing. One evening, while I was helping with homework, my son asked, "Why does Dad keep smiling like that?" It was such a small question, but it landed heavily because I knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't joy he was noticing, it was smugness, that self-satisfied glow of a man who believes he's outplayed everyone in the room. I told him adults were dealing with some complicated things and that both his parents loved him very much. Even saying it, I felt the lie scrape at me. Not the part about me, the part about him loving without control. There were nights when I questioned everything. Nights when I sat on the bathroom floor after the kids were asleep and wondered if I was making a catastrophic mistake by staying calm. Maybe my lawyer was right to fight immediately. Maybe signing had been too risky. Maybe every hour I spent pretending to be defeated gave him more time to hide money, shape narratives, prepare witnesses, polish his image. Fear is creative that way. It doesn't just scare you, it invents possibilities and forces you to rehearse them in the dark. What if the evidence wasn't strong enough? What if the inheritance trail had blurred too much over time? What if his confidence came from something I still hadn't uncovered? What if he had already positioned the children's school, our friends, maybe even parts of the extended family to see me as unstable or checked out? What kept me from collapsing was structure. My lawyer gave me tasks, and tasks saved me. Pull this file. Confirm this date. Search for that correspondence. Write down every threatening statement you can remember with approximate timing and context. Do not discuss strategy in the house. Do not confront him. Do not tip him off. Save, forward, organize, breathe. The practical rhythm of those instructions felt like its own kind of lifeline. When your emotions are trying to drag you into panic, checklists can feel like rescue. And then, little by little, my husband started getting slobbier, because celebration has a way of loosening people's grip. He was suddenly more social, more visible, more generous with money in ways that made no sense for a man who had spent years insisting every financial choice had to be tightly controlled. He went out more, bought things without the usual defensive explanations, took longer calls outside, came home with the afterglow of a man who had been reassured by somebody that his future was secure. I didn't know yet whether that somebody was a friend, a new woman, or simply his own reflection, but I knew this much. Men who are genuinely worried about a difficult divorce do not strut. Men who are quietly hiding things often do. One weekend, he had friends over in the backyard while I was inside with the kids. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but voices travel when people get comfortable. I heard laughter, I heard the clink of ice and glasses, and then I heard him say something that made me stop in the hallway and grip the wall so hard my fingers hurt. He said, "Honestly, it went easier than I thought." She signed. Then more laughter, then some people just know when they're outmatched. I stood there frozen, not because I was surprised he was arrogant in private. I knew that. It was the contempt in it, the ease, the delight. He was celebrating my supposed defeat socially, like it was some clever personal achievement. Not the destruction of his family, not the unraveling of his children's home. A win. That moment did something important inside me. It burned away whatever lingering instinct I still had to protect him from the consequences of his own behavior. Sometimes, even after years of mistreatment, part of you still clings to some softer interpretation because it feels less horrifying than the truth. Hearing him talk like that killed the last of my denial. He was not just ending the marriage, he was enjoying power. And that changed the temperature of everything. After that day, I stopped wasting emotional energy on questions like, does he know how much this hurts me? Does he understand what he's doing to the kids? Does some part of him still care? Those questions are expensive. They drain you while giving the other person room to perform innocence. The better question became, what is he exposing while he believes I'm defeated? And once I shifted fully into that frame, his behavior looked even more reckless. His messages became more confident, more directive. He started talking about upcoming school arrangements as though they were already settled. He made comments about my moving timeline without legal confirmation. He referred to certain accounts and expenses with the confidence of someone assuming he would never be challenged on details. And because he thought the paperwork I signed settled the battlefield, he stopped noticing how often his certainty outran reality. My lawyer noticed that too. Every time I sent him a fresh detail, a screenshot, a comment, a timeline note, she'd respond with the same kind of focused caution. Good.
Keep documenting. Do not react. Then one afternoon, after a longer call with the forensic accountant, she said something that made my pulse jump. She said, "He is acting like a man who thinks no one is auditing the story." That sentence stayed with me all day. No one is auditing the story, because that is exactly how controlling people survive for so long. They count on emotional fog. They count on the injured party being too overwhelmed to become precise. They count on public image carrying them through. And more than anything, they count on timing. If they can move quickly enough, intimidate strong enough, and force compliance early enough, then their version of events feels inevitable before the truth has time to organize itself. But truth was organizing itself now. Slowly, carefully, in files and notes and motions and legal language I was only beginning to understand. The accountant had found enough irregularity to justify deeper concern. Nothing dramatic on its own, not yet, but the pattern mattered. Timing of transfers around the divorce filing, financial movements inconsistent with the image he was presenting of stability, questions about what he had characterized as straightforward access and ownership, questions about the house, the inheritance-linked funds, and the way he had framed assets in the papers I signed. My attorney was no longer just cautious, she was sharpening. She explained that what happens next in cases like these is often about sequencing, not just having the truth, but releasing it correctly. If you fire too early, the other side cleans up. If you reveal too much too soon, they rewrite faster. If you move at the right moment after they've overcommitted to a false version of events, then the contradiction lands harder. That was the strategy now. Let him keep building confidence on unstable ground. Let him keep speaking as if things were settled. Let him keep acting like the stable parent and responsible wife, while the underlying paper trail told a much more complicated story. That waiting nearly broke me more than once, because while the legal process was maturing quietly, real life kept happening loudly. The kids still had school events. Meals still had to be cooked. One child got a fever one night, and I stayed up checking temperatures while also drafting a timeline of financial incidents between 1 and 2:30 in the morning. Another evening, my daughter crawled into my lap and asked, "Are you and Dad mad at each other forever?" There's no training for that kind of question. None. My throat closed, I held her and told her that grown-up problems were never her fault, that both parents loved her, that things might look different soon, but she would be safe. I said the words every mother says when her heart is splitting behind her ribs. Then, after she fell asleep, I sat in the dark and cried silently, because safety was exactly what I was fighting for, and I still didn't fully know how expensive it would be to secure it. The contrast was brutal. Inside me, dread and discipline. Outside me, bedtime stories and cereal bowls and hair conditioner and school drop-offs. And then there was him, moving through it all with that awful lightness. He started dressing better, too, which sounds petty until you've lived through this kind of thing. There is a particular glow some men take on when they believe consequences have missed them. New shirts, better cologne, more time on his phone, more attention to his reflection. He wasn't just preparing for a divorce, he was preparing for a next life, a life he thought he had funded by crushing mine. My daughter noticed before I did, in a way that children often do. She asked me one day, why did Dad keep texting and smiling at his phone? I told her adults had lots of things to handle. Neutral, calm, controlled. But that night, after everyone went to bed, I let myself consider what I had been avoiding. There may have been someone else. I still didn't know enough to make that claim, and frankly, by then, infidelity itself almost felt secondary to the larger betrayal. But if there was someone waiting in the wings, it would explain some of the sudden confidence, some of the impatience, some of the performative relief. My attorney warned me not to chase every emotional suspicion unless it had legal relevance. Stay centered, she said. The strongest case is the one built on what can be shown. She was right. Still, the thought sat with me. Not because I needed one more reason to leave him, but because it revealed one more layer of how little he believed he would ever be held accountable. Then came the first true sign that the tide was turning. It was a weekday afternoon. I had just come back from a school pickup and was sitting in the car for a minute before going inside because I needed one breath to myself. My phone rang. It was my lawyer. Her tone was clipped in that way that meant something had advanced. She said, "I need you not to react when you go inside. We have enough to move on the initial filing strategy." For a second, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't understand the words, because I did. After days of scraping together proof and living under the pressure of his performance, "we have enough" sounded almost unreal. She explained that the inheritance-linked documentation was stronger than she had hoped. The property issue was not going to be nearly as simple as he had represented. There were serious questions around how he had framed ownership and access. The financial review had identified enough irregularity to justify formal scrutiny. And his custody threats, combined with the pattern of pressure, were becoming part of a much bigger picture. "He got greedy," she plainly said. "That may end up helping you more than anything." I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring through the windshield for nothing, while my whole body reacted before my mind could. Not relief, exactly, more like the first crack in a sealed room. Air. Just a little. Just enough to know I wasn't trapped in there forever. But even that moment came with instructions. Do not change behavior, do not signal confidence, do not confront him. Let him continue. Let him keep thinking you signed away the fight. That was the hardest part, because once you know the tide may be turning, silence becomes even more difficult. Every smug comment from him started hitting me differently. Every false assumption, every little speech about practicality, every gesture of ownership, every patronizing suggestion about my future arrangements, I had to absorb without showing what I now knew. It felt like holding a live wire in my bare hands and pretending not to feel the burn. At the same time, his behavior kept feeding the case. He began talking more openly about wanting things finalized before certain financial windows shifted. That phrase mattered. It suggested timing awareness. It suggested he knew enough to rush. He also made a remark one evening about how separate funds become family reality after enough time. And I remember looking down at my plate so he wouldn't see the flash in my eyes, because that sentence told me exactly how he had rationalized what he was doing. He really believed time had erased my mother's protection. He really believed habit erased memory. He really believed my exhaustion had erased memory. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. And then came the children's school event. That night still lives in my body because it showed me how thoroughly he had committed to his own image. We both attended, smiling in public, sitting a few rows apart, pretending for one more evening that the family was still intact enough to perform. People chatted with him warmly. Teachers complimented how involved he was. Other parents smiled at us with that casual, dangerous assumption that what looks functional must be healthy. I stood there in a nice blouse, listening to people talk to him like he was such a dependable father, and I had one of the loneliest thoughts of my entire life. If I tell the truth badly, they will believe him anyway. That fear almost sent me back into old patterns, almost made me think maybe the safest thing was still to disappear quietly. Maybe peace for the kids required swallowing one final humiliation. Trauma speaks in practical language sometimes. It says, choose the least explosive pain. But on the drive home, my son fell asleep in the back seat with his head tilted toward the window, and my daughter was humming to herself softly, and I realized something that cut straight through the fog. If I let this man define reality now, my children would grow up inside his version of events. They would one day hear that he was the stable one, the organized one, the one who handled things, while their mother simply accepted what had to be done. And maybe they wouldn't know the full truth until years later, if ever. That thought hardened something in me. Not bitterness, resolve. By the end of the second week, the atmosphere in the house felt almost electrically strange. He was at the peak of his certainty. I was at the edge of action. He thought he was entering the reward phase of his strategy. I was about to step into the part of the story he had never planned for, the moment his confidence would be met with documentation, legal force, and the consequences of forgetting that I was never as powerless as he needed me to be. The papers I signed had made him comfortable. The next move would make him understand how dangerous that comfort had been. The morning of the turning point arrived with the same ordinary chaos as any other. Kids to get ready, breakfast to make, bags to pack. He was still in his usual morning routine, coffee in hand, scrolling through his phone, that faint, self-satisfied hum radiating from him. I remember looking at his profile, at the almost smug set of his jaw, and thinking, he has no idea that the ground beneath his feet is about to shift. Because while he was scrolling through headlines, my lawyer was filing motions. While he was savoring his coffee, the legal system was being set in motion to expose every lie he had built his confidence upon. It happened quickly, but not dramatically, not in a way he would immediately recognize. My lawyer had explained the strategy. No grand announcements, no unnecessary confrontations, just the methodical application of legal force. The goal was to let the process itself do the talking, to present the evidence in a way that left no room for his usual dismissive charm. The first tremor came mid-morning. I was at work, trying to focus on a spreadsheet, when my phone vibrated. It was my lawyer, and her voice was calm, almost flat, but I could feel the steel in it. "It's done," she said. "The initial motions have been filed. He'll receive notification today. They include a challenge to his financial disclosures and a motion regarding the marital home's equity, specifically related to your separate property contribution." My breath caught in my throat. Separate property. That legal term, cold and precise. It was the key in his foundation. It was the truth of my mother's wisdom finally resurfacing years later. I knew what it meant, and I knew he thought it was buried. I thanked her, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to sound professional, normal, but inside I felt a jolt. Not of joy, not yet, of sheer, unadulterated terror mixed with a fierce, quiet vindication. It was real now. The fight had officially begun, not with a shout, but with a stack of papers and a legal stamp. The rest of the day at work felt like walking through water. Every email, every conversation, every mundane task was a blur. My mind kept replaying the scene in my dining room, his confident threats, his assumption of victory. Now, those words were about to be tested against a different kind of truth. A truth backed by documents, dates, and legal precedent. When I got home that evening, the house felt different. Not outwardly. The kids were playing, dinner was on the stove, but there was a palpable shift in the air, a tension he couldn't hide even from himself. He was in the living room, standing by the window, staring out. His back was to me. I noticed his shoulders were tighter than usual. His jaw was clenched. He wasn't scrolling on his phone. He was just still. I walked into the kitchen, keeping my movements deliberate, my face neutral. "Rough day?" I asked, my voice calm, almost casual. He turned slowly. His eyes, usually so assured, had a flicker of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Confusion and a raw, cutting anger just beneath the surface. His usual performative calm was fractured. "Did you know about this?" he asked, his voice low, dangerously quiet. He wasn't yelling. He was doing something worse. He was trying to project the kind of cold, seething fury that makes people want to retreat. I looked at him, met his gaze without flinching. "Know about what?" I asked, keeping my tone even, my face blank. This was it. This was the moment. The opening. He didn't answer right away. He walked over to the dining table where there was now a thick envelope. Legal documents. He picked it up, opened it, and let the papers fan out in his hand. This challenge to the home, these questions about the accounts, this isn't what we discussed. He waved the papers in a frustrated gesture, his carefully constructed composure fraying at the edges. "No," I said, stepping closer, letting my voice hold a note of deliberate disinterest. "What we discussed was you taking everything. I signed papers based on your terms. My lawyer reviewed them." His head snapped up. Your lawyer? You had a lawyer while you were agreeing to my terms? His voice was rising now, losing his carefully cultivated calm. He sounded utterly bewildered, as if the concept of me having independent legal counsel was a personal betrayal he hadn't anticipated. Of course, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremors that were trying to shake me. I'm not a legal expert. I wanted to understand what I was signing. That was my truth, but not his. He wanted to believe I had simply crumbled under pressure. He looked at the documents again, then back at me, and his face was a picture of dawning realization mixed with pure incandescent rage. This isn't just understanding, he practically spat, tapping a page. This is a countersuit. This is claiming that the home isn't fully marital property, that your mother's funds were separated. This is insane. That was it. That was the moment. He had forgotten. Or rather, he had convinced himself it no longer mattered. He had built his entire financial strategy around the idea that those funds had been absorbed into the marriage, that time had erased the distinct legal boundaries. He had assumed my silence meant ignorance. He had assumed my agreement to sign meant I had no cards left to play. Is it? I asked, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of my head, a small, quiet question that held more weight than any accusation. My lawyer seems to think so, and the financial team that reviewed your disclosures also has a few questions. His eyes narrowed to slits. Financial team? What financial team? He was reeling now. His narrative was falling apart. The calm facade he had presented for weeks, the confident stride, the self-satisfied smiles, they were all based on the premise that he was the only one with information, the only one with a strategy. He had assumed his victory was secured the moment I picked up the pen. He picked up the phone, his hands fumbling slightly, and started to dial. He didn't say who he was calling, but I knew. His own lawyer, the person who had assured him I was defeated, the person who now had to explain why a woman who had signed everything was suddenly challenging his entire financial premise. I watched him. His back was to me again. But this time, the tension in his shoulders was different. It wasn't the tension of a man in control. It was the tension of a man reacting. For the first time in years, he wasn't dictating the terms. He was responding to mine. I walked past him, heading to the children's room. My heart was pounding, a wild, exhilarating drum against my ribs. I still had so much fear, so much uncertainty about what was to come. But a new feeling was also blooming in my chest, a fierce, protective resolve. He had underestimated me for years. He had tried to break me by weaponizing my deepest fears. But what he didn't know was that sometimes when you push a woman past the breaking point, you don't find weakness. You find bedrock. And as I closed the children's bedroom door, I could still hear his voice, now sharp with disbelief and anger, talking rapidly into the phone. The celebration was over. The game had changed, and he had no one to blame but himself. Because in his haste to take everything, he had forgotten the one thing that was always truly mine, my own capacity to fight back, not with noise, but with strategy, not with emotion, but with truth. He mistook my silence for defeat, when it was simply the sound of a woman gathering her strength. And the moment he believed I was broken, that's when his real problems began. Forever witnessed a person realize in real time that the story they've been telling themselves is collapsing? Then you know the face I saw on him over the next several days. It wasn't just anger. Anger would have been simpler. This was something more disorienting. The look of a man who could not understand how the woman he had already mentally dismissed was now standing between him and the version of the future he had been privately celebrating. He kept trying to pull the situation back into the old shape, back into the pattern that had always worked for him. Intimidate, reframe, speak confidently enough, and maybe reality will rearrange itself around his voice. But once legal truth begins to move, confidence alone is a flimsy little weapon. The days after the filing were brutal in a completely different way than the days before. Before, I had been carrying fear in silence. After, I had to carry fear while the fight was out in the open. He still wasn't really shouting. That was never really his style, unless he believed no one else could hear. Instead, he became clipped, tight, hyper-controlled in a way that almost vibrated. He started asking questions that were really accusations. How long have you been planning this? Who have you been talking to? What exactly do you think you're doing? He wanted me defensive. He wanted me to start over-explaining. He wanted me to crack and reveal how much I knew. But my lawyer had already warned me. Once the other side realizes they've underestimated you, their first instinct is not reflection. It's damage control. So I kept my answers short. I'm following legal advice. You should speak to your attorney. I'm doing what I need to do to protect myself and the children. That last line hit him hardest. I could see it every time. Protect myself and the children, because it turned the frame. For years, he had spoken as though he was the one protecting stability, managing reality, carrying responsibility while I drifted emotionally behind him. Now that phrase exposed what he had really been doing, not protecting, positioning. Not too long after that, mediation was scheduled. The word sounds civilized, doesn't it? Mediation? It sounds like adults sitting calmly around a table to work things out. In reality, it can feel like emotional surgery without anesthesia, especially when one person comes in expecting to dominate and leaves realizing the room is no longer arranged around them. I barely slept the night before. My body was running on caffeine, prayer, and the kind of numb alertness that trauma can produce when you know a major moment is approaching. I checked on the children twice before I left that morning, watched them sleeping, let myself feel, for just one breath, the full weight of what this was really about. Not revenge, not pride, not winning a spectacle. Safety, truth, a future that could not be stolen through intimidation. The mediation room itself wasn't dramatic. That almost made it worse. Neutral walls, bottled water, a stack of legal pads, chairs arranged with deliberate professionalism. The kind of room where lives are quietly rearranged under fluorescent light. He was already there when I arrived, sitting with his attorney, dressed perfectly, jaw set, trying hard to project the image he had always trusted most. Composed, rational, unbothered. The stable man, the man dealing with a regrettable but necessary situation. If someone had walked in with no context, they might have believed him immediately. That thought still scared me, if I'm honest. Even with evidence, even with motions filed, there was still a part of me that feared his performance. Because when you've spent years being misread or preemptively reduced, fear doesn't vanish the moment you gain ground. It just changes shape. My attorney greeted me with the kind of quiet steadiness I had come to depend on. No unnecessary drama, just presence. A reminder to breathe. A reminder not to let his body language trick me into forgetting the facts. That was one of the hardest parts of the whole process. Facts are one thing. Presence is another. A confident man can still make a woman feel cornered, even when the documents don't support him, especially a woman he's spent years training to second-guess herself. The session began predictably enough. General language, process, overview, but underneath the polite structure, the atmosphere was electric. He expected control. I expected resistance. My attorney expected posturing. His attorney, from the look on her face, seemed to expect a quick narrowing of issues. Then the first major point landed: the house. My attorney laid out the basis for our position with calm precision. She explained the documented traceability of the inheritance-linked funds from my mother's estate. She referenced the original legal protections around those funds. She pointed to the paper trail that connected those separate funds to the down payment, and therefore to an interest in the property that could not simply be swept aside by his preferred narrative. No theatrics, no raised voice, just evidence, placed carefully on the table like a blade being unsheathed inch by inch. I watched his expression change in stages. First, irritation, then disbelief, then something much uglier. The realization that this was not a bluff. He interrupted more than once, which was not like the version of himself he liked to perform in official settings. He tried to characterize the money as long absorbed, blended, effectively transformed by time and family use. But he was talking too much, too quickly. My attorney didn't let him drag the issue into emotion. She kept returning to the documents, dates, structure, transfers, legal distinctions. That is the thing about people who depend on dominating a story. They hate paper when it refuses to cooperate. Then came the money. The forensic concerns weren't presented like some dramatic courtroom reveal. They were introduced as discrepancies, patterns requiring explanation, timing issues around transfers, questions about disclosure and characterization of assets. Again, calm, technical, ruthless in a way that didn't need volume. My husband's attorney started asking him more questions than she had before. I noticed that immediately. The little side glances, the legal language shifting from certainty to caution. There is something almost surreal about watching someone who thought they had orchestrated the whole game suddenly become a liability to their own side. He tried to downplay the transfers, routine movement, financial management, normal adjustments. But the timing hurt him. The timing made everything look less like ordinary planning and more like strategic concealment. The mediator asked clarifying questions. His attorney asked clarifying questions. My attorney, without changing her tone, tied those questions back to his earlier attempts to push a fast settlement, his threats about taking the children, and the larger pattern of pressure. It was all beginning to connect. Not in one dramatic burst, but in that much more devastating way where each explanation he offered only forced the room to notice how many things suddenly required explaining. I could see him trying to decide what version of himself to be. Should he play offended, confused, reasonable, victimized by an overly aggressive legal response? None of the masks fit as easily as they used to, because he had overcommitted to the lie of easy victory. The signed papers that once made him feel powerful now looked very different in context, not like proof that I agreed with him, but proof that he had rushed toward advantage while overlooking details that mattered. Worse for him, his celebration had made him careless in ways that couldn't be unseen. The financial posture, the timeline, the assumptions, the smug urgency to lock things down, all of it now looked suspiciously convenient. And then the issue of custody surfaced. Not a full custody trial, not some explosive screaming match, but enough. Enough for the room to hear what kind of threats he had made. Enough for my attorney to make clear that he had attempted to use the children as leverage in early negotiations. He immediately denied the spirit of it, of course, said he had only been discussing practical outcomes, said I was mischaracterizing his concern for consistency. But here's the thing about people who rely on plausible deniability for years. Eventually, they forget that a pattern is louder than any single sentence. When every practical concern just happens to advantage you, isolate the other person, and produce fear, it stops sounding neutral. His voice changed then. I knew that voice. Not loud yet, but sharper, less polished, more desperate. He started talking over people, started insisting on what was obvious, started speaking with that familiar condescension that had always appeared when he sensed control slipping. It may not sound like much if you've never lived with it, but for me, it was one of the clearest signs that he was rattled. Public charm was expensive for him. It required confidence, and confidence was leaking out of him by the minute. At one point, he actually turned to me and said with a strained little laugh that made my stomach twist, "You're really going to do this after you signed?" That sentence hung in the room like smoke, because there it was, the heart of his misunderstanding. He still saw my signature as surrender. He still could not grasp that I had signed those papers while also refusing to sign away reality. He still thought compliance in one moment erased my right to challenge deception in the next. My attorney answered before I could. She said, signing preliminary paperwork under pressure does not waive her right to challenge inaccurate representations, hidden assets, or separate property claims. Calmly, clearly, legally. It was one of the most satisfying moments of my life, not because it humiliated him, but because it named the truth in a language he couldn't bully past.
Something in him visibly cracked then. Not into remorse, I want to be clear.
Men like him do not suddenly develop self-awareness because their strategy is failing. No, what cracked was entitlement, the certainty that he could define what counted, what mattered, what was too late, what I had the right to question. He had spent so long assuming access to my fear meant access to my future, that he genuinely could not process a system in which his confidence was no longer the deciding factor. The sessions stretched on. Offers, counterpoints, clarifications, tension tightening and releasing in waves. I was exhausted, but I stayed present. Every now and then, my attorney would slide me a note or lean in with a whispered explanation, grounding me. Across the table, he looked less and less like the man who had told me I'd never see the kids again. Not because he had become harmless, but because the machinery of his threat was no longer operating smoothly. He was being forced to answer, and answering is hard for people who built everything around controlling the question. Then came the moment, I think, I'll remember for the rest of my life. His attorney, after a long private exchange with him in the corner, returned to the table looking significantly less confident than she had at the start. She began adjusting tone, acknowledging the need for fuller financial review, indicating openness to re-examining property characterization, softening the language around the house, softening the language around asset division, softening too around the assumptions he had tried to push as fixed. It was subtle if you didn't know what to listen for, but I knew, my attorney knew, and he knew. His face went still, dangerously still. It was the face of a man finally understanding that the celebration had been premature, that the house was not his to simply swallow whole, that the hidden financial movements might not stay hidden, that the children could no longer be used as a clean threat without raising questions about his motive, and the very papers he wanted signed so quickly had not buried me. They had only made him overconfident long enough to expose himself. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The room itself was saying everything that needed saying. He had walked in expecting to preside over the final details of my defeat. Instead, he was being asked to account for things he thought I either didn't know or couldn't prove. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not power over him, power inside myself. A kind of recovered solidity, the return of my own mind after years of emotional erosion. The quiet, profound relief of no longer needing him to admit what he had done in order for it to be real. That was the true climax for me, even more than the legal advantages. Not just watching him realize he had forgotten something important, but realizing I no longer needed his version of events to survive. When the session finally paused, he stood up too quickly and knocked his chair slightly off balance. It made a small, ugly scraping sound against the floor. A tiny thing, but somehow perfect. He muttered something to his attorney and walked out of the room without looking at me. Not the smooth exit of a winner, the abrupt retreat of a man trying to get his face under control before anyone looked too closely. I sat there for a second after he left, my hands trembling in my lap. The adrenaline was so intense I could barely feel my fingers. My attorney leaned toward me and said softly, "He didn't expect this." I let out a breath I think I had been holding for years. Not because everything was over. It wasn't. There were still negotiations, still filings, still consequences unfolding. But the central truth had landed. The title of the story, the reason I could let him celebrate, had fully come due. Because he forgot. He forgot my mother's protection. He forgot the paper trail. He forgot that threats leave patterns. He forgot that a quiet woman is still thinking. He forgot that signing papers under fear doesn't erase facts.
He forgot that underestimating someone is not the same as defeating them, and by the time he remembered, the room had already changed. The story had already changed. The future he thought he had taken from me was no longer his to script. For me, resolution isn't one big cinematic moment. Not a final gavel, not a dramatic apology, not a public humiliation that wipes out every year of pain. Real endings and resolutions come in layers, in paperwork, in exhausted phone calls, in revised agreements, in quiet mornings where the fear is still there, but it no longer owns the whole room. My resolution didn't come as one triumphant explosion. It came as a long, slow reclaiming. After the mediation, the shift was undeniable. He was no longer walking through the house like a man who owned the future. He was still angry, still controlled in the ways that had scared me into silence, but there was a new ingredient in him now: caution. He had lost the ease that had made him so dangerous. He no longer spoke about the house as if it were settled. He no longer made those little comments about where I would be staying long term, as if my life was already boxed up in his head. He had learned something painful in that mediation room. I was not as cornered as he had assumed, and his own strategy was now under scrutiny. That changed the emotional weather in the house. Not into peace, let me be honest about that. There was no sudden warmth, no mature healing, no moment where he became decent because the plan had failed. But the air was different. He stopped performing victory. He stopped moving with that sickening lightness. He was more measured now, more careful, because he understood at last that every word, every financial move, every pressure tactic could be looked at differently than he intended. Once a controlling person realizes their image is no longer fully under command, they get quieter, not because they've grown, because they've become aware of risk. My lawyer and I kept pushing. That part matters. Stories often make it sound like one breakthrough solves everything. It doesn't. Breakthroughs open doors. You still have to walk through them. There were more reviews of financial records, more exchanges between attorneys, more tense conversations about valuation, contributions, disclosures, and custody language. The house issue became one of the central points in the negotiations, and the inheritance-linked protection from my mother's estate carried far more weight than he ever expected it to. The same legal detail he had ignored, blurred, or simply assumed had faded into the marriage became one of the reasons he could not just strip me of security and call it resolution. The hidden financial concerns hurt him too. Maybe not in the dramatic criminal collapse way some people fantasize about, but in the way that matters in real life. His credibility weakened. His confidence stopped sounding like authority and started sounding defensive. His attorney, who had likely entered this process believing I was another intimidated spouse ready to accept whatever the stronger personality demanded, had to adjust. And once the attorneys adjust, the balance changes. Positions soften, claims become less absolute, demands start sounding more negotiable. That's what happened here. He didn't lose everything in a theatrical instant, but he lost the right to bully the ending into the shape he wanted. And the children. That was the part I cared about most from the beginning. Not revenge, not proving I was smarter, not punishing him for underestimating me. My babies. Their sense of safety, their right to grow up with at least one parent who did not treat love like leverage. Because once the dust began to settle, it became clear that his threats about taking them and controlling access were exactly that. Threats, strategic intimidation, ugly, harmful, but not the unstoppable legal reality he tried to make me believe. He still remained their father, and the law still required structure. But he did not get to erase me from their lives. He did not get to turn me into a visitor in my own children's world. He did not get to use my terror as a shortcut to ownership of them. That truth alone felt like oxygen. There were moments in the weeks that followed when the relief hit me so suddenly, I had to sit down. One afternoon, after a call with my attorney, I stood in the kitchen holding a dish towel and just cried. No dramatic sobbing, just tears falling, while the dishwasher hummed and sunlight hit the counter, and my daughter's half-finished drawing sat in front of me. Because for the first time in months, maybe years if I'm being honest, I could feel a future that was not entirely built on managing his moods, his perceptions, his power. A future that still had pain in it, yes, still had legal complexity, still had co-parenting challenges and emotional scars, and the long work of rebuilding, but it was mine again in a way I almost forgotten was possible. One of the strangest parts of the resolution was discovering how much energy fear had been stealing from me for so long. Not just big fear, daily fear, the tiny calculations, the constant self-monitoring, the endless effort of staying one step ahead of someone else's reactions. Once that began to loosen, I felt lighter and more exhausted than I had ever been. Lighter because I was no longer performing surrender to survive. More exhausted because my body finally understood it had been in a war. Trauma often waits until safety begins before it demands its payment. So there were days I felt powerful, clear, almost reborn. And there were days I could barely get through the basics because every nerve in my body was coming down from years of tension. Both were real. Both belonged to the ending. There was also grief. I don't want to skip over that because people hear stories like this and assume the moment a woman wins back her footing, she must feel pure triumph. But grief sits beside victory sometimes. I grieved the years. I grieved the version of marriage I tried so hard to make real. I grieved the fact that my children's innocence now had a crack in it, even if I protected them from as much as I could. I grieved the younger version of myself who thought being patient and loving and composed would be enough to keep bad things from entering my home. She did not know then what I know now. Some people do not respond to love with love. They respond to it with entitlement if they mistake it for access. But even that grief changed shape over time. It stopped feeling like something that weakened me and started feeling like proof that I had loved sincerely, tried sincerely, built sincerely. His manipulation did not erase the truth of my intentions. It only revealed the limits of his character. That distinction was important for me, especially as a Black woman who had spent so much of her life being careful not to appear bitter, difficult, or too much. I had to learn that protecting myself did not make me hard. Challenging deception did not make me vindictive. Staying calm while refusing to be erased did not make me cold. It made me wise in ways pain often teaches women only after it has taken too much. The final structure of the divorce was not his dream, and not some fantasy either. It was something harder, quieter, and far more meaningful. Fairer than he intended. The house issue did not go his way. The protections connected to my mother's contribution mattered. The financial scrutiny mattered. The custody threats did not become the weapon he thought they would. And most importantly, I walked away from the process with something he tried very hard to take from me and failed. My dignity. That may sound small to people who think only in dollars and property lines, but dignity is not small. Not after years of psychological pressure, not after being threatened with the loss of your children, not after being treated like your fear was a tool someone could pull out and use whenever they needed obedience. Walking away with my dignity intact meant I no longer saw myself through the lens he had spent years polishing for me. I was not the helpless wife in over her head. I was not the emotional woman lucky to be handled by a more practical man. I was a woman who felt terror and still found strategy, a woman who stayed calm long enough to expose the truth, a woman who let the wrong person underestimate her one final time because it was the shortest path out of his shadow. The first time I laughed freely about the whole thing was much later, not in the middle of the legal process, not while the children were still adjusting, not while every detail felt raw. It happened on an ordinary evening with a friend who had known parts of the story, but not all of it. We were sitting at my table, and she asked me, "So when did you know he made a mistake?" And I said, "When he celebrated." She looked confused at first, and then I explained it. How some people become most vulnerable not when they are fighting hardest, but when they are certain they have already won. How his celebration told me exactly what I needed to know. He had stopped being careful. He had stopped respecting the possibility that I might still matter in the outcome. He relaxed into his own arrogance, and that arrogance is what opened the door for everything that followed.
We both laughed then, but it wasn't bitter laughter. It was the laughter of surviving something that once felt unsurvivable. The laughter that comes when your body finally believes the danger is no longer sitting at the table with you. The laughter of a woman who spent 2 weeks being underestimated, while the trap quietly closed around the person who said it. There were still hard days after that. Of course there were. Divorce changes families even when it saves them. Co-parenting with someone controlling does not become easy just because legal papers rebalance the field. Trust does not magically regrow. Some wounds stay tender for a long time. There were school events where we still had to stand in the same room, holidays that required painful negotiation, moments when the children asked questions that reopened old ache. And there were nights when I replayed everything and wondered how long he had truly been planning it, how many conversations he had already had, how much of our life had been calculation by the time he finally said the word divorce out loud. Those thoughts still visited me sometimes, but they no longer ran my life. That was the difference. I had crossed from survival into recovery, and recovery has a different rhythm. It is less dramatic.
It looks like checking your bank account without fear. It looks like opening your front door and feeling like the space on the other side belongs to your peace, not someone else's power. It looks like hearing your child laugh in the next room and not immediately worrying what legal threat could reach that joy. It looks like making plans more than a week ahead because your future no longer feels like it's being held hostage. It looks like rediscovering parts of your personality that fear had forced into hiding. Humor, softness, curiosity, even rest. I began to see myself differently, too. Before all this, I had thought strength meant enduring gracefully, smiling through pain, holding everything together, being measured enough that no one could accuse me of falling apart. But what I learned is that real strength is more complicated. Sometimes it looks like refusing to panic when someone is trying to panic you. Sometimes it looks like signing the paper in front of you while preparing the truth behind the scenes. Sometimes it looks like understanding that noise is not always power and silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it looks like letting a man toast his own victory while the evidence of his defeat is already moving through the legal system. And the strangest, sweetest part of the resolution was this. The thing he forgot became the thing that gave me back more than money or property. It gave me back memory, lineage, perspective. My mother had tried to protect me in a way I didn't fully understand until I needed it. Her foresight, her insistence on legal clarity, her refusal to romanticize vulnerability, all of that reached across time and steadied me when I thought I was alone. In the end, it wasn't just about a clause or a contribution. It was about remembering where I came from, remembering that I was not the first woman in my bloodline to be underestimated, and not the first to survive it gracefully enough to confuse the person trying to destroy her. So yes, he demanded a divorce. Yes, he said he'd take everything. Yes, I signed the papers. And yes, for 2 weeks, he let him celebrate. But I was laughing because he forgot. And in forgetting, he gave me exactly what I needed to take my life back.
Looking back now, the part that still unsettles me most is not that he wanted to leave. Marriages end. People fail each other. Love can thin out. Trust can rot. And sometimes the healthiest thing two adults can do is stop pretending a broken relationship is still a safe home. No, that's not the part that stays with me. What stays with me is how calmly a person can try to weaponize your deepest fear once they've convinced themselves your humanity is an inconvenience. What stays with me is how easily control can disguise itself as logic. How often cruelty borrows the language of practicality. How many women are sitting in houses right now being told that their silence is maturity, their confusion is incompetence, their exhaustion is proof they could never survive with the very person draining them. And maybe that's why this story matters to me beyond my own life, because I know I'm not the only woman who has sat at a table feeling the floor disappear under her when a man explains in a tidy voice how her future is about to be taken from her. I know I'm not the only mother who has gone cold with fear at the thought of losing her children. I know I'm not the only Black woman who has measured every reaction because she understood that pain, if expressed the wrong way, would be turned into a stereotype before it was ever treated like truth. I know I'm not the only one who has had to survive not just the problem itself, but the way the world might misread her while she survives it. And maybe that's why fear can be so seductive when it comes dressed as certainty. Fear tells you the person threatening you probably knows more than you do. Fear tells you they've already won because they sound so sure. Fear tells you not to ask too many questions because what if the answers are worse than your imagination? Fear tells you to settle fast, speak softly, disappear neatly, be grateful for whatever scraps of peace you can secure. Fear is very persuasive when you're tired, especially when you've been tired for years. That was the biggest lesson I had to learn. Fear is not always a warning to retreat. Sometimes it's a signal to get still enough to think clearly. I used to believe courage would feel loud, dramatic, defiant, a speech in the mirror, a slammed door, a perfect refusal at the perfect moment. But the courage that saved me did not look like that. It looked like restraint. It looked like listening carefully while my heart was racing. It looked like making calls with shaking hands. It looked like gathering papers while packing lunchboxes. It looked like refusing to let a man use my emotions as evidence against me. It looked like signing what he put in front of me, not because I agreed with his version of reality, but because I understood something he didn't. People are often at their most reckless when they think resistance is over. That changed the way I think about silence. Silence is dangerous when it comes from fear that has fully swallowed you. But silence can also be strategic. It can be the space where truth gathers itself, the space where your mind returns to you after someone has spent years trying to colonize it with their version of who you are. My husband thought my silence meant I had accepted his story. What he failed to understand was that I had simply stopped performing my pain for someone committed to misusing it. There is a difference between surrender and observation. He never learned it. I did. And maybe that's one of the quiet tragedies of people who live by manipulation. They become so dependent on other people's predictability that they mistake surprise for betrayal. When I challenged him, he acted like I had broken some unspoken rule, as if my agreement to remain calm under threat somehow meant I had agreed to be destroyed by it, as if his confidence entitled him to the future he imagined. That mindset is more common than people want to admit. Some people really do believe that if they dominate the conversation early enough, they deserve the ending they announced. They think intimidation is intelligence. They think emotional pressure is proof they're stronger. They think if you don't fight back in the exact way they expected, then you didn't fight back at all. But life is rarely that simple. Some battles are won by the person who speaks last, some by the person who documents carefully, some by the person who lets the other side overplay their hand, some by the woman who understands that being underestimated can be turned into cover if she stays clear-headed enough to use it. And I also learned something about dignity that I wish more women were told earlier. Dignity is not just how you carry yourself in front of other people. It is not just grace under pressure. Dignity is also refusing to let someone else define what your fear says about you. I was afraid, deeply afraid, of losing my kids, of losing my home, of being painted as unstable, of being financially trapped, of being misunderstood in all the familiar ways Black women are so often misunderstood. None of that fear made me weak. It made me human. What protected my dignity was not the absence of fear. It was what I chose to not let fear convince me of.
I did not let it convince me that his confidence was the same thing as the truth. I did not let it convince me that paperwork in his hand meant power belonged to him forever. I did not let it convince me that calm women are always losing. Sometimes calm women are simply deciding where to strike the truth so it lands hardest. And yes, I think about my mother often when I think about all of this, about the way women try to protect daughters from dangers they hope those daughters will never face. At the time, some of her caution felt excessive to me. Some of her legal instinct felt like an intrusion on romance. But now I understand that wisdom and tenderness are not opposites. She was loving me through structure, through foresight, through paperwork, through the insistence that no matter how deeply I loved, some part of me should remain reachable by my own hands if life ever turned. That lesson reached me when I needed it most, long after she was gone. She was still protecting me. And maybe that's another reason this story stays so close to my heart. It reminded me that women are often held up not just by their own strength, but by the strength of women who prepared the ground before them. I don't tell this story because I think every ending works out neatly. It doesn't. Some women don't have supportive lawyers. Some don't have traceable records. Some are even more isolated, more financially controlled, more emotionally battered, more afraid than I was. I know that, deeply. So if anything, the lesson isn't some shallow little slogan about always winning in the end. The lesson is more honest than that. It is this: never confuse the appearance of power with the fact of power. Never assume the loudest person understands the truth best. Never assume the one who looks calm in public is the one who is right. And never assume that a woman who has gone quiet has stopped thinking. She may be remembering. She may be noticing. She may be preparing. And that matters far beyond divorce. It matters in families, in workplaces, in friendships, in every place where someone counts on your fear to make you smaller than you really are. There are people who move through life believing that because they can intimidate, they can define reality. They count on your exhaustion. They count on your desire to avoid conflict. They count on stereotypes. They count on your love for other people. They count on your instinct to keep the peace. What they often fail to count on is this: there comes a point when peace without truth becomes another kind of prison, and once you see that clearly, your whole posture changes. That's what happened to me. I stopped trying to be understood by the wrong person. I stopped trying to rescue the marriage in ways that required me to abandon myself. I stopped believing that if I just explained my pain more perfectly, he would suddenly become ethical. I stopped treating his confidence as evidence. And in that stopping, I got something back that I didn't even realize I had nearly lost. Trust in my own perception. Trust in my ability to read the room, read the pattern, read the danger, and still choose a path that protected what mattered most. In a strange way, that may have been the greatest gift hidden inside the worst season of my life. Not the house, not the legal victory, not even the relief of watching his plan collapse. It was the restoration of self-trust. Because once a person has spent years making you second-guess your reactions, your memory, your instincts, getting those things back feels almost holy. It feels like coming home to yourself after someone has been renting out your mind without permission. And if there is one thing I would want anyone hearing this story to carry with them, it's this: if someone is trying very hard to rush you, scare you, corner you, and define the outcome before you've had space to think, that urgency is often part of the strategy. Slow your breathing, slow your decisions if you can. Ask questions, look at paper, look at timing, look at who benefits from your panic, look at what they need you to believe in order for their plan to work. Very often, the thing they need most is your fear. Not because fear is proof they're right, but because fear makes you easier to move. And once you understand that, everything starts to look different. The threats sound less prophetic and more tactical. The confidence sounds less impressive and more rehearsed. The pressure sounds less inevitable and more revealing. And your own quiet starts to sound less like.
So, yes, I let him celebrate. I let him think my signature was surrender. I let him taste the victory he had been planning for. And for 2 weeks, he walked around believing he had done what controlling people always dream of doing, rewriting someone else's future without consequences. But I was laughing because he forgot. He forgot the paper. He forgot my mother. He forgot the records. He forgot the law. He forgot the danger of underestimating a woman who has finally stopped begging to be believed. And most of all, he forgot that fear can silence a woman for a moment, but sometimes, if she survives that moment, fear is exactly what teaches her how to win without ever having to shout. If you've never had to rebuild your life after somebody tried to reduce it to paperwork and leverage, it's hard to explain how strange the aftermath feels. People imagine that once the legal turning point happens and the worst threat loses its teeth, you should feel instantly free, instantly healed, instantly clear. Suspicious. You keep waiting for the old pressure to reappear. You keep bracing for one more twist. You keep wondering if relief is real, or if it's just another pause before the next demand. That was the season I entered after everything shifted. Not the battle itself anymore, but the part no one really sees. The part where a woman has to relearn what her own life feels like when she is no longer organizing it around the moods and maneuvers of the person who tried to control her. The first thing I noticed was how tired I was. Not regular tired, not mom tired, not overworked tired, bone-level tired, soul-level tired. The kind of exhaustion that only appears once your body believes it is finally allowed to stop performing emergency. For so long, I had been running on a mix of vigilance, routine, and pure necessity. Get the kids ready, smile when needed, keep records, take calls, watch your tone, don't react, don't tip him off, think clearly, keep the house functioning, keep the children feeling safe. Keep yourself from collapsing until the truth is positioned strongly enough to protect you. That kind of living creates a false strength, the kind that looks solid from the outside because it has no choice. But afterwards, when the biggest wave has passed, your body sends the bill. I would stand in the grocery store staring at cereal boxes and suddenly feel tears rising for no reason I could explain to anyone quickly. I would sit in the car after school pickup and have to take a minute before turning the key because my hands felt too heavy. There were mornings when I was grateful, deeply grateful, and still felt like my limbs were filled with sand. That was one of the first things I had to learn in the aftermath. Just because you made it out doesn't mean your nervous system immediately gets the memo. Survival teaches your body to distrust calm. Recovery teaches it slowly that quiet is not always the setup for danger. The children were adjusting too, each in their own way, and that is where the aftermath stopped being about me alone. Because adults can intellectualize change. Children feel it in waves. One day they're laughing and asking for snacks like everything is normal, and the next day they're crying because the wrong parent tucked them in, or because someone used the wrong bowl at breakfast. People who don't understand childhood grief think kids only react to the big moments, the obvious ones. But often it is the tiny disruptions that hold the deepest emotion. A different schedule, a missing routine, an unspoken tension at pickup, a question they're too scared to fully ask. I learned to listen under the surface. My daughter got more clingy for a while. My son became quieter in a way that made me watch him more closely. He would go off by himself and build things, rearrange things, line things up as if order in small objects could steady him when the larger shape of family no longer made sense. I started being even more careful with what I said around them. Not in the old way, not in the fear-based, hide everything and smile way. More honestly, more gently.
I wanted them protected, but I also wanted them grounded in reality. So I learned how to tell the truth in child-size pieces. That no, none of this was their fault. That adults make decisions children didn't ask for. That love can still be real even when a family changes shape. That home is not only one address. That they were safe with me. Safe with me. I must have repeated that 100 times. Maybe more. Not because I thought one sentence could fix the instability they were feeling, but because children need anchors, and I wanted my voice to become one of theirs. And then there was the social aftermath, which was its own kind of emotional minefield. Once a marriage starts ending publicly, everyone becomes a quiet detective. Some people ask direct questions, some ask none at all, but watch with the intensity of people who think silence makes their curiosity invisible. Some choose sides without saying so. Some perform concern while really searching for a scandal. And then there are the people who mean well, but still somehow make you feel more alone. I had no idea. He always seemed so nice. You two looked so solid. These things are always complicated. I learned quickly that not everyone deserves the full truth of your pain. Some people only know how to process stories if they can fit them into familiar little boxes. Mutual breakdown, communication issues, irreconcilable differences. They are uncomfortable with the quieter forms of power and harm because those forms force them to question too much about how charm operates in the world. So I became selective, not secretive. Selective. I told the truth where truth could be held carefully. I spared myself where it would only be consumed carelessly. That was another aftermath lesson. You do not owe your wound to every curious person with good manners. Protecting your peace also means protecting the way your story is handled. And if I were lying to say there wasn't anger, there was. More than I let myself feel at first. During the fight, anger was dangerous. It could have made me impulsive. It could have clouded strategy. It could have tempted me into confrontations that benefited him. But afterwards, when the legal dust began to settle and the immediate threat lessened, anger had room to surface. Not wild rage, not vengeance. Something heavier, cleaner. The anger of seeing the years differently. The anger of realizing how often I had made myself smaller to maintain a peace that wasn't real. The anger of remembering specific comments, specific looks, specific little humiliations, and understanding that they had not been misunderstandings at all. They had been methods. That realization hurts in a special way, because once you see the method, you start visiting memory with a new lens. Things you once excused become sharper. Moments you once called stress reveal themselves as strategy. The first time he dismissed a financial question as me being dramatic. The way he always made his calm sound like proof of my imbalance. The way he used the children as abstract symbols of stability whenever he wanted leverage. The way he kept the image of a good man polished so carefully in public. I replayed all of it. And yes, some nights I was furious. Furious at him. Furious at myself. Furious at the social conditioning that had trained me to be so careful not to be seen as difficult that I sometimes delayed being seen as endangered. But anger in the aftermath can be useful if you let it. If you don't let it consume you, it can become instruction. Mine did. It taught me where my boundaries should have lived earlier. It taught me what kinds of charm I now recognize as control wearing cologne. It taught me that feeling uneasy around someone does not require courtroom proof before it matters. It taught me that I am allowed to ask questions about money, about power, about plans, about tone, about anything that affects my safety and my children's future. It taught me that peace bought with self-erasure is too expensive. That became one of the clearest truths of the aftermath. One of the quieter changes was financial, not just the legal financial outcome, but the emotional relationship to money itself. For years, money had been tangled in dependency, confusion, access, and subtle intimidation. Even when bills were paid and life looked stable, there was always that underlying feeling that information lived somewhere just out of my full reach, that numbers could be used against me, withheld from me, framed for me, interpreted at me. In the aftermath, I had to build a new kind of confidence. I had to sit with spreadsheets, ask questions without shame, relearn details I had once allowed myself to be distanced from. Some of it was practical, some of it was deeply emotional, because financial clarity after financial control is not just a skill, it is healing. It is a woman putting keys back into her own hands and deciding she will never again call herself bad with this stuff just because someone benefited from her uncertainty. The house carried its own aftermath too. Every home stores memory. That's the beautiful part, and the terrible part. Certain corners still held echoes of old tension, old conversations, old versions of myself trying very hard to keep things from falling apart. But slowly, room by room, the house began to feel different. Not because the walls changed, because I did. I moved things around, threw things out, opened curtains more often, rearranged furniture, bought a plant I probably would have once told myself was an unnecessary expense, lit candles on weeknights instead of saving them. Little acts, maybe, but they mattered. They turned the space from a site of management into a place of belonging. I wanted my children to feel that too, that this was the home where Dad controlled the emotional air. This was home, and home could feel soft again. There was also the question people rarely ask directly, but often wonder, did he ever apologize? No. Not in any real way. There were moments of irritation, moments of performative civility, moments where he acted inconvenienced by consequences, but not true remorse, not the kind that requires
Self-confrontation. And for a while that bothered me more than I wanted it to, because some part of me still wanted the simple human relief of hearing, I was wrong, I scared you, I tried to break you, I misused your trust. But that relief never came, and eventually I understood something freeing. His lack of accountability was not a missing piece of my healing, it was just further evidence of who he was. Waiting for accountability from people who survive by avoiding it can keep you emotionally chained to the exact personality you are trying to move beyond. I had to stop making my peace dependent on his clarity. My real closure came from repetition, from days stacking into weeks where I handled things differently than I once would have, from not flinching every time an email came in, from checking in with my children and hearing more laughter than tension, from making decisions without mentally rehearsing how he might react, from sleeping deeper, from not needing every room to be emotionally scanned the moment I entered it, from catching myself in small moments of ease and realizing with almost disbelieving gratitude that this was what safety felt like when it wasn't constantly negotiated. And there were moments of joy, too, real ones, even while healing was still uneven. The first quiet Saturday morning when the kids climbed into my bed and we stayed there too long eating toast and laughing at something silly on TV. The first time I handled a financial task that used to intimidate me and realized I wasn't intimidated anymore. The first holiday that felt different but not shattered. The first evening I sat alone after they were asleep, looked around the house and felt no dread at the sound of a key in the door, because there was no key in the door, no one coming home to shift the air with one expression. The peace was almost loud in those moments, not empty, spacious. There is one memory from the aftermath that I think says everything. My daughter and I were folding laundry together, a task so ordinary it almost disappears while you're doing it. She was talking about school, about a friend, about some tiny injustice involving crayons, and then she stopped and looked at me very seriously. She said, "You smile with your eyes now." I had to turn away for a second because I thought I might break open. Months earlier, she had asked why I looked sad when I was smiling. Now she was noticing the difference without fully understanding the story underneath it. Children know.
They may not know the legal details, the financial maneuvers, the emotional strategy, but they know when safety returns to a mother's face. That was the aftermath in one sentence. I smiled with my eyes now. Not every day, not perfectly, not without scars, but truly. And if I sound changed, it's because I am. Surviving something like that doesn't leave you untouched. It shouldn't. I am less eager to explain myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. I am less impressed by polished calm and men who benefit from women's self-doubt. I am slower to dismiss my own discomfort. I am more practical, more legally aware, more attentive to patterns. But I am also softer in some ways, more grateful for ordinary peace, more tender with women carrying burdens they haven't named yet, more aware of how often what looks like composure from the outside is really someone's last functioning layer of survival. Pain made me sharper, yes, but survival also made me kinder, where kindness is safe. The aftermath is where the lesson becomes a life. Not just a dramatic story someone tells, but a daily way of moving through the world with more truth in your hands. It is where you stop measuring yourself by what almost happened to you and start measuring by what you protected, what you learned, what you reclaimed. And when I think about it now, all these years and all those fears later, I still come back to the same astonishing thing. He really thought he had won. He really thought a signature was the end. He really thought my fear had erased my mind. He really thought celebration was safe. And maybe that's why I can tell this story without shaking now, because the woman he tried to trap did not disappear. She went quiet, she got strategic, and then she came back for her life piece by piece until even her children could see it in her smile.